brutality in his fight against terrorists?
Let me say, if you step back and take a look at history for a moment, you will find the message we just heard from Mr. Gingrich, from Vice President Cheney, and Mr. Rush Limbaugh to be the same. It's a message of fear. Be afraid. Be very afraid. And to say that this president is not doing everything in his power to keep America safe is just as irresponsible as anything I've ever heard said on your program. This president is dedicated to the safety of America. He has said clearly that he's not going to allow a single dangerous person to be released in the United States or be in a position to harm us. He's doing everything night and day to keep us safe. But let's look at what we have here. The president said in his speech he didn't question the motives of those like Vice President Cheney who thought they were keeping America safe. The fact is, in a way, it didn't work. Guantanamo became an inspiration for recruiting terrorists around the world. At the end of the day, it was President Bush in his second term who abandoned the Cheney approach, who said we're not going to use torture, we're going to close down Guantanamo because it isn't working to keep America safe. Now, I just want to tell you, when people like General Colin Powell step forward and say to us, put torture behind us and close Guantanamo, I believe they are on the right track. Here's a person who served our nation in the military and on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he believes we can keep America safe with a much better approach. And this notion somehow that President Obama is not keeping America safe has been rejected by the American people. They trust his leadership.
Let me just say, I think people should be afraid. I think the lesson of 1993, the first time they bombed the World Trade Center, was fear is probably appropriate. I think the lesson of Khobar Towers, where American servicemen were killed in Saudi Arabia, was fear is probably appropriate. I think the lesson of the 2 embassy bombings in East Africa was fear is probably appropriate. I think the lesson of the coal being bombed in Yemen was fear is probably appropriate. And I'll tell you, if you aren't a little bit afraid after 9/11 and 3,100 Americans killed inside the United States by an effort, if you aren't worried about the second wave attack that was designed to take out the biggest building in Los Angeles, right, I think that you are out of touch with reality.
But Speaker Gingrich, you make the point about how Vice President Cheney felt personally, personal fear. And isn't President Obama's argument that fear as a basis of national security policy is not sustainable over time? How do you come up with a sustainable legal framework, a sustainable national security policy? Don't we elect leaders to transcend fear for lasting policy?
Look, we sustained the Cold War against the Soviet Empire for 44 years because our national leadership came together and said to the country, there are sufficiently great dangers to America to sustain our power worldwide. I mean, we sustained against the Soviet Empire worldwide for 44 years. Now, that requires us to have I think the first level of debate is simple. How much should you worry about something truly terrible happening to America? I belong to the wing that believes we live in an age when very few people using very dangerous weapons can cause incalculable damage. And I think we should take very strong steps to make sure that doesn't happen.
Senator Durbin, let me ask you this. You've heard criticism from the right of President Obama. There's also criticism from the left. And that is, there is very little distinction between President Obama's approach to fighting terrorists and President Bush's approach. And there are numerous examples. Military commissions are still in place. Targeted killings are going on. The issue of state secrets. The detention of war criminals in a kind of middle ground who can't be released, who can't be tried. The president is also for that. Is there a difference between the two?
First, let me tell you that America cowering in fear is not going to be a strong nation. I disagree with Mr. Gingrich. We can understand the threat, we can deal with it rationally, we can be strong, and we will be safe with President Obama. But this notion that fear is going to guide us is what brought us to the notion of weapons of mass destruction and this war in Iraq and all that has cost us. You know, Vice President Cheney said the other day, without hesitation, I'd do everything all over again. He hasn't learned any lesson from history. Now, as far as President Obama's approach at the National Archives, he made it clear, and he was open to the American people. And this is what he said. There will be military commissions, but these are going to be commissions that are going to follow our constitutional values. We are going to basically say that we're not going to have hearsay that has to be rebutted by a defendant. We're going to allow for the right of counsel. We're going to have the basic approaches under the law that the Supreme Court is going to demand of us.
Do you see that correlation between President Bush's approach and President Obama?
I would say they both have military commissions, and we've had them back to the time of George Washington. But the approach of President Obama is one that is closer to our Constitution and our rule of law. And just consider this. In 7 years in Guantanamo, there were exactly 3 who were convicted by military commissions, and those were thrown out by the Supreme Court. President Obama has learned from that lesson of history. He's going to make sure that any military commission, military tribunal in the future is one that can be sustained by the courts.
Let me move on to the controversial issue of the House Speaker currently, and that's Nancy Pelosi, and the fact that she accused the CIA of misleading Congress with regard to briefings about the Bush administration's so-called